Hello, everybody. My name is Katrina, or you can call me Kat for short. I'm going to be presenting my grant proposal topic today, which is really going to encompass the idea of how does inadequate sleep in night shift work affect the health of its employees. Right. So before we dive into today's presentation, just to kind of give you a good breakdown of the slides that will be coming up, we're going to have our background information, known research, which has already been previously conducted by other researchers regarding this topic. Why isn't it so important? Why did I even choose this topic? And then finally our references. All right. So into everything. So to kind of give you a little bit of background information, usually we see night shift work with employees that are involved with nurses, first responders, police officers, firefighters, but it doesn't just necessarily mean them, right? We do have other occupations that do work on a 24-hour schedule, waiters, waitresses, cooks, private security. There's a lot that just goes into it, right? So my proposed grant topic is really going to try to study the effects of how night shift work affects its employees, and then the minimum hours that are required by the individuals, right? Because there's always pros and cons to every occupation, right? So before we jump into the negatives of night shift work, there are some benefits to it, right? So usually individuals that work kind of that not normal 9 to 5 shift or 8 to 4 shift, usually you'll see them starting work at like 3, 5 p.m. and then usually working until almost like 3 a.m., 4 a.m. the next morning. Usually people opt for this personal choice because usually means an increase in pay, which who doesn't like who doesn't like extra money. There's also an easier commute because there is less traffic on the road. And then there's also not as many administrative functions, such as like scheduling meetings, audits, or anything else that's kind of like within that nature, right? So kind of drifting away from those pros, we're going to kind of shift towards, unfortunately, the negative aspects of this, right? So part of the cons with night shift work is that the metabolic homeostasis is going to get disrupted, all right? And I'm going to go into that more into the next slide. But there's also some psychological effects that usually happen because of this, right? So I know for one of the studies they had done specifically on nurses, they found that nurses that worked an overnight shift tend to have more of injury increases than their morning counterparts, specifically needle stick injuries, because people are a little bit more fatigued, obviously, during that time, because the body is saying, hey, I want to sleep, but you're like, no, we gotta work. So we unfortunately have to stay up. So and because of that disruption, right, people usually tend to increase kind of negative habits, which is usually smoking, right? People usually opt for nicotine because it kind of gives them that kind of head rush, gives them a little bit more energy. They tend to increase their mealtime frequency, snacking frequency, which isn't always necessarily bad. However, other research has also shown that people who do tend to increase their frequency also tend to gravitate towards high carbohydrates or high fat meals, which is not the best, right? In terms of kind of like having a good, healthy balance within your diet. So kind of touching a little bit about other previous research that has been done. There is a lot more that has been, more specifically though, kind of internationally and globally. It's usually around nurses and hospital care workers, just because that's usually the more frequent occupations that we see night shift work. But like I had mentioned earlier, that's not always the case, especially for the average day-to-day people like us. So part of the research that they have found is that there have been instances where people who work night shifts have an increased susceptibility to obesity because of an increase in their BMI levels, because it kind of really stems back to the increase in frequency of meals and the poor choice of carbs or fats to try to maintain that energy throughout the night. Unfortunately, then this kind of snowballs into an increase in blood pressure and blood sugar. And we all know whenever you go to a doctor, your weight and blood pressure is the first two things that they love to take, because if that's off, then that kind of gives some key factors that there may be something else that's not really going right within your system internally. which then kind of brings us into our circadian rhythm, right? So our circadian rhythm is kind of like our bodily clock, right? So that kind of helps to regulate all of our bodily functions. Specifically, one researchers were able to kind of coin the idea of shift work disorder, or SWD, and this was shown to have higher BMI and obesity levels. And because this circadian rhythm is disrupted, the body is not adequate enough to fight off infections, for example. People were known to have an increase in the common cold, flus, respiratory illnesses, because their homeostasis was disrupted, and they weren't getting that adequate enough sleep that they needed to try to repair those bodily functions. Which also kind of goes back into sleep and melatonin, because that is our main hormone that we need to produce at night, so our body kind of restores all of that, right? After working all day, you do need that sleep to try to reevaluate and jumpstart the body into, performing the next day's work. But on night shift, that tends to get a little bit trickier, especially if people are working, period, like an 8-hour increment for 3-4 days or 5 days out of the week. And then on the weekend, they're trying to go back to kind of like a morning shift schedule to be with their friends and family. So then their circadian rhythm is even more erratic because it doesn't know specifically what timings to release for digestion, sleep, etc. So what does this grant helps to identify, right? So out of all this past research, like I had mentioned, they had really only targeted nurses and health practitioners. However, my study, I really want to gather kind of data on not just nurses. I want to do other occupations as well. Whether it's, like I said, restaurant workers, or more of a pharmaceutical manufacturing aspect of it, where it's kind of like a 24/7 crane operators. So it's not just isolated to the medical field, right? Because we all know medical field's a little stressful, but not are all other jobs, right? So that is what this grant really tries to investigate, as well as trying to identify what the minimum hour of sleep requirement is needed for these individuals that are working these night shift hours, these not normal 9 to 5 work schedules. So, so then this kind of piggybacks us to why is this important? So I chose this topic specifically because I work night shift. And I did it for the better pay and the better commute and the less administrative functions. However, I have been doing this for about 2 years now, and I have noticed that my weight has unfortunately increased, and as well as other bodily measurements such as my waist circumference, legs, and arms. So even though my diet is still the same and my exercise routine is also still the same, still gaining weight. And I'm like, well, there only can be one explanation, right? It has to be the sleep. So I'm hoping, um, I will be able to identify it for myself as well for others. So for this, my hypothesis is that if individuals are working night shift of 8-hour increments for a 4-day period minimum, and they are getting less than 7 hours of sleep, which is the recommended kind of like nightly dose, then employees will show a noticeable decline in sleep efficiency. They will show an increase in their waist circumference, a disruption in their circadian rhythm, which will then put these individuals at risk for long-term health effects. So like I mentioned, at the end of this grant, I hope to identify, the required, kind of minimally required sleeping hours that one needs to perform their functions, as well as also kind of come up with different counteractive measures, not just for the employee, but also for the employer. Business can't run if all of their employees are tired and fatigued at night. So I'm hoping that I will be able to kind of establish like a good baseline, whether or not that's, have the workers take off a little bit more frequently, or kind of give them like periodic naps throughout the night, just to kind of like re-jumpstart the body into kind of maintaining that bodily homeostasis that I had originally talked about. So here is going to be all of my references. So if you are intrigued as much as I was, still am, obviously, here are my sources that I was able to find. They do cover lots of good topics, especially internationally. Like I had mentioned before, a lot of these scientists and a lot of these studies were done all over the world. They are, like I had mentioned before, a little bit more pinpointed to the medical field. However, they do present very good data, especially when it comes to, the associated health risks when people on night shift are working on their shift for an extended period of time, typically over like 2 to 5 years. And thank you. And stay tuned for an update on the proposal. And I appreciate you taking the time to do this presentation with me. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye bye.